welcome to Crypt Liturgy. Before we begin this powerful true story, tell us where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is there right now. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this video and stay with us until the very end, because this story will shake you and teach you something history tried to hide. Now let us step into the swamps and forests of Louisiana in the year 1841, where courage, cunning, and calculated vengeance met under a moonless sky that would forever change how slave hunters moved through the darkness. Louisiana Territory in the early 1840s was a place where wealth grew from human suffering. Sugar and cotton plantations stretched across rich soil, watered by the Mississippi River and its countless tributaries. The land was fertile, but the system that worked, it was built on chains. More than 300,000 enslaved people labored under conditions so brutal that many did not survive their first year in the fields. The heat was merciless. The work was endless. And the men who enforced this system were among the cruelest in all of America. Among the enslaved was a man whose true name had been Kofi, but who was called Samuel by the plantation ledgers that treated him as property. He had been born in West Africa in a warrior culture where manhood meant skill with weapons, knowledge of tactics, and the courage to defend family and village. He had been captured at age 19 during a raid that destroyed his home and killed his father. The slave ship that brought him to Louisiana in 1837 carried 200 souls chained in darkness. 70 died during the crossing. Kofi survived not because he was lucky, but because he was strong and because something inside him refused to break. Even when his body was tested beyond what seemed endurable, he arrived in New Orleans. He was purchased by a sugar planter named Richard Whitmore, who owned a large estate 60 miles upriver. Whitmore was known among other planters as a hard master who believed that enslaved people needed to be broken completely before they could be useful. The first year on Whitmore's plantation was designed to accomplish that breaking. Kofi was whipped for small mistakes. He was starved periodically to teach dependence. He was forced to work from before sunrise until after sunset with only brief rest on Sundays. The other enslaved people on the plantation moved like ghosts, their spirits crushed by years of such treatment. But Kofi did not break in the way Whitmore expected. He learned to hide his thoughts behind a mask of compliance. He obeyed orders without question. He worked harder than required. He never spoke unless spoken to. To Whitmore and the overseers, he appeared to be exactly what they wanted, a strong worker who had accepted his status. What they did not see was that behind his silence, Kofi was studying everything. He was learning the layout of the plantation. He was memorizing the routines of the guards and overseers. He was identifying the weapons they carried and where they kept them. He was mapping every path through the surrounding swamps and forests. And he was waiting for the right moment. That moment came in the spring of 1841, when Whitmore sold Kofi's closest friend, a man named Thomas who had helped Kofi survive those first brutal months. Thomas was sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi as punishment for speaking back to an overseer. The sale was sudden and without warning. One morning Thomas was there. By afternoon he was chained in a wagon heading west. Kofi watched from the fields as the wagon disappeared down the road. Something hardened inside him in that moment. He had survived 4 years by telling himself that endurance was enough. But watching Thomas taken away made him understand that survival without dignity was just slow death. Plantation had a system for dealing with enslaved people who tried to escape. A group of 6 slave hunters lived in a cabin at the edge of the property. These men were not plantation workers. They were professional trackers who hunted runaways for payment. Their leader was a man named Jacob Barnes, who had spent 20 years tracking escaped slaves through Louisiana swamps. Barnes was known throughout the region as the most successful slave hunter operating. He claimed to have captured over 300 runaways during his career. He worked with 5 other men, all of them skilled with weapons and dogs, all of them brutal in their methods. Barnes and his men did not simply capture runaways. They made examples of them. When they brought someone back, the punishment was public and severe. Whippings that left permanent scars, brandings, sometimes mutilation of toes or fingers to make future escape more difficult. The enslaved people on Whitmore's plantation lived in constant fear of these hunters. Everyone knew someone who had tried to run and who had been brought back broken. The hunter's cabin stood as a silent threat. Smoke rising from its chimney like a warning. Kofi had been planning his own escape for months. He had identified a route through the swamps that would take him toward New Orleans, where he believed he could blend into the free black population. He had cached small amounts of food at hidden points along the route. He had studied the patterns of patrol schedules. He was nearly ready, but watching Thomas disappear changed his thinking. If he simply ran, he would be hunted like all the others. Barnes and his men would track him through the swamps using their dogs and their experience. Even if he made it to New Orleans, they might find him there. The system would continue unchanged. Other people would be hunted. Other people would be broken, so Kofi made a different decision. He would not run away. He would stay and fight. But he would not fight openly where strength and numbers favored the masters. He would fight in the way his warrior culture had taught him, through ambush, through surprise, through turning the hunters into the hunted. The plan that formed in his mind over the following weeks was dangerous and required perfect timing. But Kofi had spent 4 years preparing without knowing what he was preparing for. Now he knew the hunters operated on a predictable schedule. Every week, Barnes and 2 of his men would ride out on patrol through the surrounding area, checking for signs of runaways and maintaining contact with other plantations. They would leave Thursday evenings just before dark and return Friday mornings. The remaining 3 hunters stayed at the cabin to guard the plantation and to be ready if an escape occurred. The Thursday night patrol always followed the same route along the edge of the swamp where most escape attempts began. Kofi had watched this pattern repeat for months. He knew where they rode. He knew when they would pass certain landmarks, and he knew where the trail narrowed through thick forest before reaching the swamp edge. On the night of June 10, 1841, Kofi put his plan into motion. He had told no one what he intended because he could not risk word spreading. After the evening meal, he returned to his cabin as always. He waited until full dark had settled. Then he slipped out quietly and moved toward the tool shed where plantation equipment was stored. The shed was locked, but Kofi had observed which boards were loose. He squeezed through a gap and found what he needed: a heavy axe, a long-handled scythe with a blade he had sharpened himself weeks earlier, and a coil of rope. He took these items and disappeared into the forest, The place he had chosen for the ambush was perfect. The trail narrowed between two massive oak trees, whose roots and hanging moss created natural cover on both sides. The hunters would have to pass through in single file because the path was too narrow for horses to walk side by side. Visibility would be limited even in daylight. At night, with only lamplight to guide them, the hunters would see nothing beyond the small circle illuminated by their lanterns. Kofi worked quickly in the darkness. He looped rope across the trail at chest height, tying it to trees on both sides but keeping it slack so it would not be visible to approaching horses. He positioned the rope at exactly the height where a rider's throat would meet it if the horse continued forward at normal speed. Then he concealed himself in the thick undergrowth on the south side of the trail where the rope was anchored. He held the axe in one hand and waited. The wait was long. Hours passed in silence, broken only by night sounds of insects and distant frogs. Kofi did not move. Warriors learned patience before they learned anything else. His father had taught him to become part of the forest, to breathe with its rhythm, to wait without impatience until the moment arrived. Around midnight, he heard what he had been waiting for, the sound of horses approaching from the direction of the plantation. Lamplight flickered through the trees, growing brighter as the riders came closer through gaps in the foliage. Kofi could see them. 3 men on horseback, just as expected. Barnes rode in front, carrying a lantern. The other 2 followed close behind. They moved with the casual confidence of men who had made this journey countless times and who feared nothing in these woods. They talked in low voices. One of them laughed at something Barnes said. Their rifles were slung across their backs, unready, because they expected no trouble as Barnes's horse approached the narrow section between the oak trees. Kofi tightened his grip on the rope. The horse entered the gap. Barnes held the lantern high to see the path ahead. The other 2 riders were close behind, following into the narrow space. This was the moment. Kofi pulled the rope tight with all his strength. The rope snapped taut at neck height just as Barnes's horse took another step forward. The rope caught Barnes across the throat with tremendous force. The impact lifted him backward off his horse. He made a strangled sound and fell heavily to the ground. The lantern flew from his hand and shattered. Darkness swallowed the trail. The 2 men behind Barnes had only a second to react. Their horses shied and reared in confusion. Before either man could reach for his rifle, Kofi was upon them. He had released the rope and burst from cover, swinging the heavy axe. The first blow caught the nearest rider in the side, knocking him from his horse with a scream. The second rider managed to draw his rifle, but Kofi was already moving. He swung the axe again. This blow struck the rider's arm. The rifle fell. The man tried to wheel his horse around, but the trail was too narrow and the panicked animal could not turn. Kofi pulled the man from his horse and struck him down. The entire ambush had taken less than 30 seconds. 3 armed slave hunters lay on the ground. One was unconscious from the rope strike. The other 2 were badly wounded. Their horses had bolted into the darkness. The forest was silent again, except for the labored breathing of the injured men. Kofi stood over them, holding the axe. For a long moment he did not move. Years of rage pressed inside his chest. These men had hunted his people like animals. They had caused suffering beyond measure. They deserved death. But Kofi did not kill them. not because of mercy, but because of something more calculated. Killing them quickly would be easy. What he chose instead was harder and more dangerous, but would send a message that simple killing could loathe. Dragged the three men together and used the rope to bind them tightly. When Barnes regained consciousness and began to struggle, Kofi struck him hard enough to daze him again. Working quickly, Kofi stripped the hunters of their weapons, their boots, their shirts. He left them bound in the darkness, wearing only pants. Then he took their rifles and vanished back into the forest. Behind him, the hunters lay helpless on the trail, waiting to be found by the morning patrol. When they were discovered hours later, the story of what had happened spread across the plantation and through the surrounding country like fire through dry grass. The reaction was immediate and intense. Richard Whitmore flew into a rage when he learned what had occurred. How could 3 armed hunters be ambushed on their own territory by a single slave? It seemed impossible. Yet there lay Barnes and his men, humiliated and stripped, proof that the impossible had happened. Whitmore demanded that Kofi be found immediately. Rewards were posted. Additional slave hunters were brought in from neighboring plantations. Armed patrols began searching the swamps and forests. But Kofi was not in the swamps. He had returned to the plantation before dawn and had slipped back into his cabin as if he had never left. When the alarm was raised and all enslaved workers were assembled for questioning, Kofi stood among them looking as confused and frightened as everyone else. The search continued for 3 days. Whitmore could not believe that the person responsible was standing in his own fields. The assumption was that a runaway hiding in the swamps had conducted the ambush, perhaps someone with military experience from Africa who had been living as a maroon for months or years. Patrols combed the swamps but found nothing. The mystery deepened. Fear began to spread among the white population. If slave hunters could be ambushed and defeated, what else was possible? The foundations of the system depended on the belief that enslaved people were powerless. This attack challenged that belief directly among the enslaved. A different kind of change was occurring. The story of the ambush was told in whispers. No one knew who had done it, but the fact that it had been done at all created a subtle shift. People stood a little straighter. Guards noticed that orders were followed with fractional delays that had not existed before. Nothing open. Nothing that could be punished. But something in the air had changed. The hunters had been hunted. The predators had become prey. That reversal could not be undone by any amount of searching. Kofi waited 2 weeks before his next move. He understood that the element of surprise was his greatest weapon. If he struck too quickly, patterns would emerge. If he waited too long, the moment would pass. During those 2 weeks, security increased on the plantation. More guards were posted at night. Patrols were expanded. Barnes himself, recovered from his injuries but deeply humiliated, swore publicly that he would find whoever was responsible and would kill them slowly. He increased his patrols and began varying the times and routes to make ambush more difficult, but Kofi was patient. He watched and waited. He noticed that the hunters had begun traveling in larger groups, believing that safety lay in numbers. 4 or 5 men would ride together now instead of 2 or 3. This made conventional ambush more difficult. But it also meant that fewer hunters remained at their cabin at any given time. Sometimes only one man stayed behind while the others patrolled. This created a different kind of opportunity On the night of June 24th, while 4 hunters were out on patrol, Kofi made his move. He had observed that Marcus Webb, one of the younger hunters, would be alone at the cabin that night. Webb was less experienced than the others, having joined the group only 6 months earlier. He was strong and mean, but he lacked the seasoned caution of men like Barnes. Shortly after midnight, Kofi approached the cabin from the rear where woods came close to the structure. A single lamp burned in one window. He could see Webb's shadow moving inside. Kofi had brought with him a container of lamp oil he had stolen from the Plantation store days earlier. He also carried flint and steel. Moving silently, Kofi reached the cabin wall. The wood was old and dry. He poured oil along the base of the rear wall, soaking the lowest boards thoroughly. Then he struck sparks into a pile of oil-soaked cloth. The fire caught quickly, flames spreading along the oil-soaked wood. Within minutes, the rear wall was burning. Smoke began filling the cabin. Kofi heard Webb shout in alarm. The front door banged open, and Webb stumbled out, coughing, looking back at the cabin in confusion. Kofi stepped from the shadows behind him and struck him once with a heavy branch. Webb collapsed unconscious as flames consumed the cabin. Kofi dragged Webb away from the building and into the forest. By the time the fire was visible from the main plantation house and people began running toward it, Kofi and his prisoner had disappeared into the darkness. When Webb regained consciousness at dawn, he found himself tied to a tree deep in the swamp, his weapons gone, his boots gone, and a message carved into the bark beside him: "The hunted are learning to hunt." The burning of the hunter's cabin and the capture of Webb created panic that reached far beyond Whitmore's plantation. Meetings were held among plantation owners throughout the region. How was this happening? Who was responsible? Theories ranged from organized Maroon groups to northern abolitionists, somehow operating in Louisiana. No one considered that a single enslaved person living openly on the plantation could be conducting these attacks, because such a thing seemed beyond possibility. Yet that is exactly what was occurring. Kofi had become what modern warfare would call a guerrilla fighter. He used surprise, mobility, and knowledge of terrain to offset the superior numbers and weapons of his enemies. He struck at night when fear was greatest. He vanished before retaliation was possible. And most importantly, he was learning from each encounter and adapting his methods. The attacks continued through the summer of 1841. On July 8th, 2 hunters tracking a runaway through the swamps were themselves ambushed. One was injured. The other managed to escape, but only after abandoning all his equipment and running in panic through knee-deep water. On July 22nd, a patrol horse was found dead, shot cleanly through the heart. The rifle that killed it had been taken from one of the earlier ambushes. The message was clear. The attacks were connected, and whoever was conducting them had access to captured weapons. By August, the psychological impact had become as important as the physical attacks. Slave hunters throughout the region were refusing assignments near Whitmore's plantation. The profession that had once been seen as safe and profitable now carried real risk. Some hunters quit entirely. Others demanded double payment to work in the area. The cost of maintaining the slave system was increasing. More importantly, enslaved people across Louisiana were hearing these stories. The fact that resistance was possible, that the hunters could be defeated, that the system was not invulnerable, This knowledge spread through invisible networks that connected plantations. Across hundreds of miles, Whitmore himself became obsessed with finding the person responsible. He increased rewards. He brought in additional armed men. He implemented new security measures, including nighttime curfews and random searches of slave quarters. The plantation became a fortified camp. Yet the attacks continued. On August 15th, a storage shed containing hunting equipment and weapons was burned to the ground. On August 28th, a group of 3 hunters reported being followed through the swamps by someone they could not see but could hear moving parallel to their path. When they tried to chase this shadow, it vanished completely. They returned to the plantation shaken and unwilling to go out again. It was during this time that Kofi made his most audacious move. He had observed that Barnes, humiliated by the initial ambush and desperate to restore his reputation, had begun leading patrols personally almost every night. Barnes wanted to be the one to capture the ghost warrior, as enslaved people were quietly calling Kofi. He wanted revenge for the rope that had nearly killed him. This obsession made Barnes predictable. Kofi studied his patterns carefully. By early September, he was ready for a final confrontation. On the night of September 12th, Barnes led a patrol of 5 men into the swamps following a reported sighting of suspicious movement. The patrol was heavily armed and moved cautiously. But Kofi had spent weeks preparing the area they were entering. He had identified every path and every landmark. He knew where the ground was solid and where it was soft. He knew where visibility was clear and where it was blocked by vegetation. As the patrol moved deeper into the swamp, following what they believed was a fresh trail, they were actually following marks that Kofi had deliberately created to lead them exactly where he wanted. The place Kofi had chosen was a section where the trail passed through. Standing water surrounded by thick cypress trees and hanging moss. Visibility was limited to a few yards in any direction. The patrol was forced to move in single file, their horses sloshing through water that reached to the animals' knees. Barnes rode in front, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the shadows. The other 5 men followed close behind. Nervous but trusting Barnes's experience, what they did not see was that Kofi was not ahead of them on the trail. He was behind them, moving through water so quietly that not even the horses sensed his presence. He had left the trail markers to draw them in. Now he followed, closing the distance. When the patrol reached the deepest part of the water, where escape would be slowest and most difficult, Kofi struck. He fired the first shot from cover, hitting the last rider in the patrol. The man screamed and fell from his horse into the water. Before the others could react, Kofi fired a second shot, hitting another rider. Panic exploded through the patrol. The horses reared and thrashed. Men shouted. Barnes tried to rally them, but the swamp made maneuvering impossible. Shots were fired wildly into the darkness. Kofi had already moved to a different position. He fired again. A third man fell. Barnes made a desperate decision. He ordered his remaining men to abandon the wounded and retreat immediately. The patrol fled in complete disorder, leaving 3 of their number behind in the darkness. Kofi did not pursue. He waited until the sounds of their retreat had faded completely. Then he moved to where the 3 wounded men lay in the shallow water. He could have killed them easily. Instead, he took their weapons and left them alive to tell their story. He wanted them to return with their tale of being hunted and defeated in the very swamps where they had hunted so many others. The impact of this defeat was devastating for the slave hunting system throughout Louisiana. Barnes and his remaining men abandoned Whitmore's plantation within days. Other hunters refused to replace them. The plantation that had once been known for the most effective slave hunting operation in the region now could not find anyone willing to do the work. Word spread that trying to hunt slaves near Whitmore's land was suicide. The ghost warrior would find you in the darkness and would make you the prey. Planters complained loudly but found no solution. The psychological advantage had shifted completely. Kofi continued his campaign through the fall of 1841. By November, he had conducted more than a dozen successful attacks against patrols, hunters, and overseers. Not all were violent. Some involved theft of weapons or supplies. Others involved leaving messages that created fear and uncertainty. The plantation system in that region of Louisiana was beginning to buckle under the pressure. Planters met repeatedly to discuss the crisis but found no effective response. The traditional tools of control, violence, hunting, punishment were proving insufficient against an opponent who fought using different rules. The end of Kofi's resistance came not through military defeat but through betrayal. In late November, an enslaved man named Joshua, desperate to improve his own situation and hoping to win favor with Whitmore, provided information suggesting that Kofi might be involved in the attacks. Joshua had noticed that Kofi sometimes disappeared at night, and that he seemed less afraid than others when stories of the attacks were told. Joshua's suspicions were vague, but Whitmore was desperate enough to investigate anyone. Kofi was taken from the fields on November 28th and interrogated harshly. He denied everything. No physical evidence connected him to the attacks, but Whitmore had him locked in a cell while a more thorough search of his cabin and possessions was conducted. That search revealed nothing because Kofi had been careful to keep nothing incriminating. However, Joshua provided additional information, mentioning that he had once seen Kofi near the tool shed late at night. This detail, combined with the fact that tools had been missing after several attacks, was enough for Whitmore to continue holding Kofi for 2 weeks. Kofi was imprisoned and questioned repeatedly. Whitmore used torture, trying to force a confession. Kofi endured in silence. He admitted nothing. But the attacks had stopped. No more ambush occurred. No more fires were set. The coincidence was noted. Suspicion hardened into certainty. Even without confession, Whitmore became convinced that he held the person responsible for 6 months of terror. On December 14, 1841, Kofi was taken from his cell to be executed. Whitmore had decided that formal trial was unnecessary. Whether or not Kofi could be proven guilty beyond doubt, making an example of him would serve the broader purpose of restoring control. A gallows was erected in the center of the plantation, where all enslaved workers were forced to assemble and watch as Kofi stood on the platform with a rope around his neck. Whitmore demanded a final confession. Kofi looked across the assembled faces of people he had lived among for 4 years. He saw fear in some eyes. He saw respect in others. He saw Amina, a young woman he had protected once from an overseer's violence. He saw old Marcus, who had taught him which plants in the swamp were safe to eat. He saw dozens of faces that carried their own silent suffering. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. He said that a warrior fights for his people even when victory is impossible. He said that chains can hold the body, but not the spirit that refuses to surrender. He said that the hunted had learned to hunt, and that this knowledge could not be taken back. Whitmore gave the signal. The platform dropped. Kofi's body swung in the cold December air. Silence held the assembled crowd. No one moved. No one spoke. They stood as required and watched as required. But something had changed inside that silence. Something had shifted that could not be shifted back. The knowledge that one person armed only with courage and cunning had held an entire system at bay for 6 months. The knowledge that slave hunters could be hunted. The knowledge that the roles of predator and prey were not fixed by nature, but could be reversed through will and action. After the execution, Whitmore ordered Kofi's body left hanging for 3 days as a warning. But the warning did not work as intended. Instead of creating fear that would enforce submission, it created anger that would simmer quietly for years. The enslaved people on Whitmore's plantation and throughout the region who heard the story did not forget. Kofi became a legend, a symbol of resistance, proof that fighting back was possible, even against overwhelming odds. His story was told in whispers in the quarters at night. It was carried by hired-out workers to distant plantations. It became part of the hidden history that enslaved people maintained, the history of those who refused to accept their chains quietly. The impact of Kofi's resistance extended beyond the immediate. Slave hunting as a profession declined significantly in Louisiana during the years that followed. The attacks had exposed the vulnerability of hunters who had believed themselves untouchable. Insurance costs for slave hunting operations increased. Recruitment became more difficult. The financial calculations that supported the system shifted slightly, but importantly, the cost of maintaining slavery through violence and intimidation had increased. The psychological advantage that masters had relied upon had been damaged. These changes were subtle, but they added to growing pressures that would eventually contribute to the system's collapse. What do you think about the story of Kofi, who the masters called Samuel, but who never forgot his warrior name? Do you think his 6 months of resistance changed anything real, or was it only symbolic? Can one person make a difference against an entire system of oppression, or does real change require mass movements? These questions matter because they shape how we understand resistance and courage. Kofi did not overthrow slavery in Louisiana, but he proved that slaves were not helpless. He proved that the hunters could be hunted. He proved that the system's power was not absolute, and those proofs mattered to the people who carried his story forward. This has been another forgotten story from Voices from Forgotten Souls. Remember where you are watching from. Share your city, your country, and the time you listen to this story. If you have not yet subscribed, do so now, because history remembers those who remember it.